In this episode, we talk to Dr. Charles Donovan of Imperial College London about some of the most important and burning issues in sustainable investment. Charles is Executive Director of the Centre for Climate Finance and Investment at Imperial College Business School, which has been an extremely important part of the wider conversation around all things ESG and sustainable investment. And it's an incredibly important conduit between the worlds of business and the worlds of academia. The Centre, which has won awards from Finance for the Future for its climate leadership and its work driving change through education, is known for its incredibly important work around issues like the transition to net zero, the financial risks of climate change, and the global impact of clean energy on investment returns. In this episode, we talk to Charles about his role at Imperial's Centre for Climate Finance and Investment. We talk about how the Centre collaborates with asset managers. We talk about what asset managers can be doing to avoid greenwashing, and whether managers should be thinking about divestment or indeed engagement with their underlying companies that they work with. We also talk about the role of regulation, whether we'll see COP26, which will, of course, be hosted in Glasgow later this year, have any meaningful impact on sustainable investment. I hope you enjoy this episode. Well, thanks for joining us today, Charlie. I thought we could start off just for those of us who are listening who might not be as aware of what you have been doing at Imperial the last few years. I wondered if you could talk to us in a little bit detail about what you've been doing, what your role's been at the Imperial Centre for Climate Finance and Investment.
Yeah, my pleasure. And thank you very much for having me. So my name is Charlie Donovan. I've been teaching at Imperial College for about 8 years now, and I run a research center called the Center for Climate Finance and Investment that sits in the business school at Imperial. And I'm also the academic director for an MSc in Climate Change Management and Finance, which again sits in the business school and fairly unique in terms of a real focus on training financial analysts, but financial analysts who are aware and have the right skill sets to be dealing with the changing nature of investments in a rapidly changing world. So yeah, but my background comes from the financial sector and in the energy sector. So kind of came to academia late, but hopefully better late than never.
I think that's such an important point about training analysts to be able to think sort of very rigorously in terms of some of these issues, because I think what's interesting is when you look around the industry now, especially the people who've got a decade or so's worth of experience, a lot of these people would not have been specifically trained in thinking about financial analysis through this lens. So it's quite an important element.
And it's also the case that financial theory and what we teach students is just really poorly matched for these needs. And so if you think about up and down, the class that you would have taken, the class that anybody interested in finance or economics would have taken as their kind of core corporate finance, wouldn't have addressed it all and would have treated the environment as really a subset and external to the production function that we think of in economics. So it's not just about, having a couple of chapters on climate change and just about, can I understand what a megawatt hour is relative to a barrel of oil? There are some pretty deeply fundamental issues associated with, what do I do with this information? What do I do with forward-looking risks that I really don't have a strong historical basis to calculate them? I mean, all of risk management is based upon extrapolating from the past and into the future. So, whereas there are some things in this program that are really exciting and new, I still see a lot of progress that we have to make to think about teaching materials that are going to be relevant to specialist programs like this, but are going to be relevant to, every business degree on the planet, because still by and large, we're seeing students come out of university with a head full of ideas and being asked by their employers to unlearn those things and relearn in a different way. And obviously that's not acceptable.
I think to your point just then about what do we actually do with this information, obviously one of the things that you've been doing over the last few years is actually putting out quite a lot of really important research around a lot of these topics as well, which is obviously, I know, been really well received with the wider industry. But to that question around what do we actually do with that information, can you talk to us a bit about how you can and have worked with asset managers specifically to tackle some of these challenges?
Well, I don't think many asset managers thought that they would be in a position to be having to deal with the kind of questions that are being put towards them by their clients today. And the big question for all of those firms is, how can we continue to tell a story on, responsibility, but at the same time starting to really deal with a much harder edged issue, which is some of these things around climate are looking increasingly like priced financial risks. And so there's been a bit of a bifurcation now in which there's some part of this job, which asset managers have, many of them have done for many years, which is around, let's say, a sustainability theme, but begin to separate that from a slightly harder edged question that their portfolio managers are having to ask about. Do I want to be in this stock or not, given what I'm sort of casually understanding as some real headwinds to the sector, given policy, technology, whatever it might be. So yeah, we've tried to do some of that. I think it's hard, quite honestly. A lot of people don't want to read academic research, and I think that there's a great reason for that. A lot of it's very dry, way too long. It's hard to get, where's the point? And some of the methodological issues that we thrive on as academics just are irrelevant and useless to most people. So we have definitely tried to create a bit of a new mold around something that sits within an academic institution that speaks to practitioner questions and hopefully applies the rigor of academic research, but finds new ways of communicating that. And I wouldn't say that we've got it 100% right now. It's certainly over the last year and a half, all of our attention spans have gotten even shorter than they were before, but there is a space there, and that we're trying to fill, and others are trying to fill too, which is to speak to, use those capabilities of academic research, but to employ them towards much more near term and high impact questions that need to be answered now.
I think it's a really important point you've just made in there, which is that it's not just about doing research; it's also about communicating in a way where something actually gets done about it. And I know that's something where you've expended a lot of energy making sure that the research you do gets into a wider conversation, especially through the media and things like that. That's obviously been a crucial part of your strategy.
It's been a big part of the strategy, but it's hard to know whether it's working, quite honestly, because we know that when we worked with you guys to put out stuff, we can see things about when it hits the FT, when it comes out in Bloomberg, and those are all quite good scores on the board, and that you're having some influence. But beyond that, it's quite challenging. In academic research, we have kind of a very established scoreboard around which journals you publish in and their impact scores. And so, by consequence, you get into that journal, you track how much it's downloaded, and what the rating of that journal is, and kind of job done. When you're releasing into the broader public and trying to influence the boardroom debate, as we are with scientifically driven information, it's really hard to know what's the output of that. I can't go survey every CEO out there and find out did they see our stuff, did they think about our stuff, and quite honestly, that the answer 9 times out of 10 is probably not. It's very hard to permeate that level, but that's the ambition, and I think that we've got to challenge ourselves to just like a well-established scoreboard that exists for academic research, to think about what does an impact-driven research agenda look like? How do you measure that? How do you create a real sense that you're best of class? And that's something that academic institutions and business schools haven't had to think about, but I think is really important in this space.
I think that's a really interesting point in terms of that impact with C-suite decision makers, is that unless you've got a captive audience and you've locked them in the room and you can do some sort of surveying of them, you've got no idea whether it's actually resonated or even landed at all. And I think also there's the challenge that, to be honest, this is a sort of multi-year long conversation that needs to be had as well. And some of the impacts could be 10 years down the line, and how on earth do you measure the impact of that? So that's definitely a challenge. I wanted, if I can, to come back to something you touched on right at the beginning, which is that there's a recognition amongst asset managers that there's a lot of pressure from both internal and external stakeholders to communicate around ESG and sustainability and all of these great things. But I think obviously that also leads to pressure sometimes to communicate where perhaps you shouldn't. And we end up in this sort of greenwashing territory, which we hear a lot about. Do you think what would you say would be the key things for an asset manager to think about to make sure that they're sort of staying on, if you like, the right side of history when it comes to communicating around more responsible investment?
That's a tough question because it's obviously it's a tough industry, and you don't have a luxury to a lot of times to only stick to what it is that we have, where are our great proof points about what a great firm we are. What the truth is that most asset management firms today are trying the best they can to be part of that, as you say, on the right side of history, but without upsetting the apple cart in a way that puts them in a position where that if the tide goes out, they're sitting there, waving the sustainability banner while everybody else has sought refuge from that. From that process of the tide going out, in which we know, some people look better than others. So I think that there is a process right now, and it will come even more, probably more strongly in the next time we get a decent market downturn, which is that which of these strategies are actually built for the long term. How much is window dressing around existing activities and just trying to put the lipstick on the pig, as some people have referred to it, and how much of it is thoughtfully crafted, thinking about the world and some serious structural trends that are happening, how to position against that, how to sort of develop alpha generating strategies which are responding to that. And at the same time, not everybody's got the opportunity to look like a brand new kind of duck. And so this is that process of trying to stay close and in the pack and not raising too much attention, but knowing that to make a really big impact on, say, a net zero agenda is going to require doing some things differently, because we don't have a global economy at the moment that's aligned for net zero. And so the idea that an asset manager can be net zero without some really fundamental changes in the composition of their portfolio is a bit of fantasy. So these are the tensions. And the more that those strategies are deemed to be, productive on a risk-adjusted return basis, the more that this will quite naturally go in that direction. So the next couple of years, in that respect, I think are going to be critical.
You talk about structural trends, and I think one of the things that we did in our recent ESG report was to sort of lay out some of the areas where we felt there was sort of significant white space, if you like. And I think we felt that there was white space around biodiversity, white space around active ownership, there was white space around the sort of pathways towards net zero, that there was room for asset managers who had the capability to talk meaningfully to that, to sort of create a bit of white space for themselves. What other structural trends would you say there are that asset managers should be sort of alive to when it comes to thinking about conversations to get involved with?
So for me, the kind of the concept that underpins almost all of that is the idea of a decline in natural capital. I think that this is when you think about climate and biodiversity and a lot of very important issues, it can be frustrating for people because I think it's kind of yet another set of issues. But actually, a lot of those start to relate back to the same thing, which is that we've, throughout the period of industrialization that we've been in, we've really used forms of natural capital as usually a free input and certainly a free output with respect to, the cost of disposal of whatever waste that process generated. And we're finally coming up. We didn't think it was possible, but it seems, what science is telling us is we are coming up against, planetary boundaries in a lot of respects, whether that's what the atmosphere can deal with, whether the oceans can deal with, what land systems can deal with. And this is kind of then the bigger frame that we see. Well, we are, we're not in a period in which, anybody expects the world to run out of food or some of the more dire and apocalyptic predictions that have been put forward about it. But we are moving up against issues. that are of real import to people's livelihoods, that will change discretionary income at the household level, which will be felt by corporations, and which governments will ultimately be on the hook to deal with. So this is, for me, the bigger kind of meta frame, that if asset managers can think about where within their investing footprint, where sort of the boundaries are being breached, what that means exactly, not just that, well, that's a terrible thing and shouldn't happen, but what are the real consequences of that? And then starting to deal and build, investment hypotheses, concurrently from that. And so, yeah, rather than seeing that we're just, yet again, another sort of issue that's coming into an undefined space, seeing how all of these issues become manifestations of a bigger sort of structural issue around natural capital, and ultimately a very concerning rate of decline of natural capital in certain areas.
Yeah, and I think that sort of takes us back to where we started this conversation, which is, it's all very well talking about these issues, but what can you actually do? And I think one of the interesting sort of debates that we've seen people starting to get into, but I don't think in enough sophistication, is around the balance between divestment and engagement. And I'd love to get your thoughts on if there's a balance there, if asset managers should be prioritizing one or the other, or what your take on that conversation is.
So this has been controversial, hasn't it? Because you have certain people who, convinced that divestment is an important part of the strategy, and then others who have, kind of been loath to go there. And sometimes the reasoning is good. Sometimes you think the reasoning is just kind of a justification for the strategy that's been adopted. I think that what's coming up as the most impactful is really this hyper engagement, and that's where there's some activist investors taking very small amounts of shares, and where they're having success in AGMs where maybe other activists were not, which is they seem to have the skills to get the other 49.9% of shareholders on board, so that actually these resolutions are passing, not just being raised. And that's a huge change. And so I think that the very first thing on engagement is that clearly a number of big asset managers have come around to the idea that they were talking one game in terms of policy, and talking a very different game when it came up to the voting season. And those contradictions are starting to unwind themselves a bit. So clearly there's nothing from a full divestment strategy that happens other than probably sectoral tilting. I mean, that's that's not going, and consequentially probably some overvaluations in parts of the economy which are less carbon intensive in one sense of accounting. But are we really going to accomplish what we're trying to accomplish by everybody plowing into that? Most definitely not. So the divestment was certainly interesting as part of a social movement, as part of a raising the stakes. But in terms of long-term progress, I think this kind of hyper engagement model is really interesting. And clearly the bigger players who don't adopt those kind of strategies, but sensibly be part of those coalitions that form at specific company AGMs. It's encouraging that a lot more large asset managers are responsive to that. And I think we've seen over the last 6-12 months some really sort of stunning wins that are moving people really towards thinking that binding limits are going to start to become the rule of the day when we talk about some of the bigger carbon emitters out there, and organizational transformations that need to happen to enable that have to happen in a hurry, because this is no longer a very far out issue at all.
I guess there's actually quite an interesting tension in the sense that actually, when you think about it, the threat of divestment gives more power to those people who are trying to engage with, for example, the fossil fuels industries, because it gives them more weight to that conversation, if that makes sense.
I guess it could. I mean, I guess the sort of the economist's answer always back is that you would have to be one hell of a shareholder for divestment to have even a blip in terms of impact on share price. And obviously
really the threat across the wider industry of divestment gives those who are still engaging maybe a bit more.
Yeah, I mean, look at coal. I mean, coal is very much in a position now where most of the Western banks have stepped away entirely from coal. That has not yet fully had repercussions in the equity markets, but that's next. So, if we think about divestment more broadly as just exclusions and thinking about exclusions either on a risk basis that I just don't see a story in this sector any longer, full stop, or that I need to limit my exposure to it in some way. So divestment is in some ways a subset of an exclusion policy that exists across all security types, and is a very necessary tool for people to say, quite simply, we just don't want to be in this anymore. And the justification for that obviously changes, but it's part of the toolkit, and it should be the toolkit for anybody who's gets to a point where they see that certain types of activities are just not necessarily morally repugnant, but just no longer make sense in the idea of strategic asset allocation that they have.
We've talked about the role that asset managers have. We've talked about the role that academia can play as well in terms of that conversation. But obviously, regulators have a huge role to play in this. And I'd be sort of interested to get your take on what you think some of the key pieces of upcoming regulation that will have an impact on the way that we have to think about these issues.
So for asset management, it's trickier, let's say. So banks obviously, have gone first, and that's because banks have a much more the way that they operate. They're part and parcel, a state-sponsored moneymakers, and so it's very natural that they would be very much more quickly under the thumb of regulators with respect to climate-related risks. Now, looking at stress tests around, are bank balance sheets in appropriate shape to weather some of those risks, particularly at some more extreme views. So that's all been happening in asset management. There's obviously been a lot of initiatives, particularly led by the industry, but it doesn't have the same regulatory interaction that certainly that banking does. So this is one where it's going to have to find its own way, and there's a lot more of an opportunity for the industry to itself articulate what should be its proper role, what should be its the standards, what will be the common approaches, particularly on how people report things. Clearly in banking, there's a certain amount of space for that, but it's much more likely they're likely to be told than they are to be able to suggest. And so, these are important moments for the asset management industry to use that, freedom of that it has, and to put in place that things that make people believe that there's going to be a high degree of integrity in the way that the industry responds to these issues.
I think this brings me quite nicely to my last question, which is around COP26 Glasgow, obviously happening later this year. Do you think that's going to have any meaningful impact on the wider conversation? Do you think we'll see anything interesting come out of that for asset managers?
I think it's bound to be a terrible disappointment, and it probably should be in a lot of ways, at least for the finance community, because the COP is not 26 versions now is really not the venue by which it can't be the tent for everything. And there's a lot that happens at a conference of parties under the UN process that needs to be done. And there's a very particular agenda, and country representatives show up and they negotiate forms of text, and that's really what that whole thing is about. Clearly, it's a great thing that COP26 has been infused with a lot of ambition around the private sector. Clearly, has a lot of very important folks, thinking about what this means as a milestone, and what it means to kind of follow up on the engagement that came with the finance industry, in particular, that came from the Paris Agreement. But it's just not the place in which we can have binding, resolutions, and which real negotiations in this domain, the one that we're talking about, finance and the private sector. It's not the domain in which those negotiations occur. It's not the domain in which sort of there can be agreements be made. But it's the tough work here. It really comes down to, as you alluded to, policymaking and regulatory bodies that are relevant to the finance industry, which by and large the COP is a non-event for them. So there's a lot to be done, and hopefully in terms of direction setting and confidence building, that there are good outcomes, but it will be a disappointment for anybody who's looking at some specific set of actions for different parts of the financial sector to be announced, committed to, ratified, whatever it is. It's just there will be broad brushes, but the work of this actually happens in many other places. So a bit of disappointment should be the base expectation if you're a observer of this particular piece of the puzzle.
My base expectation is that we'll see a fair amount of PR activity around this for everyone concerned. But we'll see how that goes. I suspect that you'll be absolutely right on this, but we'll await further developments with interest.
Indeed.
On which note, I know we've run out of time now, but Dr. Charles Donovan, thank you very much for joining us. It's been very insightful and entertaining as well. So hopefully everyone will enjoy it. Thanks very much.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Charlie.
Okay, take care.